I'm going to present something that's a little different probably from what you've been hearing today, but it all sort of ties in terms of what we've been talking about, in terms of we have way more people who are exposed, and we're also seeing the increasing incidence, frequency, and severity of these hazards related to climate change. So I'm going to sort of talk about, now that we know all of this stuff and we've made these choices to be more at risk and live in more hazardous areas, what can we do about it? Particularly with respect to people who don't have a lot of resources and access to do things to protect themselves. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Building Resilience Against Climate Effects program in Florida, and then also in California. So this is just sort of the outline of the things I'm going to cover today in terms of the background of the program, focusing on some projects that we're supporting in Florida, and then looking at some ongoing research. And I don't know if you've talked about this today, but sort of thinking about the intersections of public health and climate change is now coming to the forefront as something that's really important, but hasn't really been focused on over these past 10 years when the climate change discussion has been heating up. Climate change is predicted to exacerbate conditions which will impact existing health problems and create new conditions that will severely increase the problems associated with health in the future. So those things kind of include things like respiratory diseases, vector-borne diseases, food security, nutrition, weather-related injuries, as well as the disruption of health and emergency response services. But some populations feel the impacts of these hazards more than others, right? So we tend to talk about these vulnerable populations who already have compromised immune systems, or their immune systems or their bodies are still developing, like children or pregnant women, or those who have susceptible systems, those who are already sick, who have immunocompromised diseases, and they are exposed in even higher rates to the impacts of climate change. But there are also other socioeconomic determinants like income, education, access to transportation, that then elevate their vulnerability in the face of an impact and then limit their adaptive capacity to respond once the impact has passed. So knowing that there's an increasing link between climate change impacts and health, there's been growing attention in terms of thinking about programs and policies that will support county health departments in adapting and preparing for climate change impacts. So the Building Resilience Against Climate Change program is a CDC-sponsored program, don't tell anyone, that is across a number of states, conservative and not conservative, as well as 2 cities. Florida Brace started in 2012 at the Florida Department of Health, and it's a 5-year cycle where we go through this process of forecasting what the climate impacts are, projecting the disease burden, assessing the interventions with respect to how are we going to address public health impacts, developing an adaptation plan, and then evaluating the impact of that plan. So since its 5-year cycle, the first 5-year cycle, it's moved over to Florida State, which is now where it's at, and it's under the purview of FSU Co-ops, Geography, the Geography Department, and the Urban Planning Department. So we're focusing really on helping county health departments implement their local climate change adaptation strategies. We try to do this by creating partnerships between the county health department as well as other partner organizations, including our technical advisory group, which is a panel of scientists and experts and policymakers who can give insight and feedback into the process of how to go about doing these projects, as well as a community advisory group. So it's sort of from the top down as well as the bottom up. And the bottom up is not necessarily they're at the bottom, but more like they're on the ground doing this work. So essentially community groups, nonprofit organizations, practitioners, people who are making these changes on the ground to inform how the county health departments can create programs and policies that address the specific hazards that they're interested in. And then we also try to generate interest in terms of doing these adaptation projects through offering mini grants. So they're small pilot project funded mini grants where they say, here's a little bit of money that you wouldn't ordinarily have to support maybe an extra person to do some type of climate adaptation work. So it's expanding the capacity, but also providing them an opportunity to experiment and explore things they wouldn't necessarily do if they did not have the money. So they focus more on interventions, specific interventions, which I'll talk about, as well as evaluating the projects and the programs that they implement. So we're thinking about this in a way that is very integrated right? That we're providing the internal program support through a very multidisciplinary team. We have a geographer, a health geographer, I'm an urban planner, we have climate scientists, all sort of contributing different elements to the process with a specific focus on rectifying inequities and attending to the differential impacts with specific groups in order to inform policies, but also build more relationships so that it's sustained into the future. It's not just a one-off pilot project. So this is an example of one of our processes in terms of deciding who gets a mini grant, and it's not like everybody's clamoring to get a mini grant, but you know, we have to sort of make it competitive. So we assess those who put in requests for proposals or an application. We identify whether or not does this really jive with what we're trying to get them to do in terms of their project goals, and then try to connect people with different partners and conduct group discussions on how they're going to go about implementing the project, and then selecting the health department that's going to receive the grant and then help them into the future as they go implement it. So this is one of the examples, Sarasota, which is down in Southwest Florida. They wanted to understand how to get access and functional needs populations, which is what? What do you think that means? Show of hands. Who am I talking about?
People that don't have access to transportation.
Right. Right. How we get those people who do not have access to transportation to be more resilient in the face of a flooding event or a significant hurricane event or a tornado, even when they cannot evacuate as anybody else can because they have specific constraints. And they found that they wanted to do participatory workshops, which were very interactive and engaged with the groups who were actually impacted by this or have experienced this, to understand what their constraints are, how they can rectify those constraints, and then how we can provide information to increase their knowledge and awareness of what to do in the face of an event. So this is just sort of the groups that they targeted to do these workshops and the health impact assessment. And I don't know if you can see them, but it's a pretty big list. So some people showed up and some did not show up, but for a good part, they had a lot of representation. So first, they wanted to understand who's at risk and where. So they did a GIS analysis, which overlaid medical vulnerabilities over physical vulnerabilities, and then the projections of what is going to be in terms of a storm surge for our Category 1, 3, and 5 hurricane. So they identified obviously the places that would be most at risk for a Category 5, Category 3 goes right up the river, and then those who are right on the coast are very vulnerable to a Category 1. And then on top of that, they identified the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure that would be at risk, the health infrastructure that would be at risk, as well as the evacuation route. So where are all of these highly vulnerable, sick, elderly, transportation deficient people living in relation to the evacuation routes, right? But they didn't only do that, so you can say, okay, well, we know where they all live, and what we need to do is just carry more buses over there or create more evacuation routes so more people can get out. But that's not where they stopped. They ended up doing participatory workshops to get feedback from the communities. Like, okay, let's hear why you actually cannot evacuate. Is it just because you don't have a car? And they found that there are a number of reasons. So that then informs the type of policy and strategy that you develop to address that issue, right? So some people said there were no buses. We couldn't even get to the bus stop to get to a bus. That they didn't know what to do with respect to a flooding event. So they had no idea of how to respond to it. Or some of them they couldn't drive. They weren't qualified to drive. Either they were blind or they were too young. So figuring out how to address the specific issue was really key in terms of working through those workshops. And then they came up with recommendations on what they needed to do to integrate it into their current public health policy and planning process. So that's one way of supporting adaptive capacity and development from a public health perspective. Another way is thinking about, okay, the programs that you already have in place, are they working, right? Or do you need to do some tweaking? So Volusia, which is on the other side of Florida, but they're both coastal, and they're facing a lot of the same issues, wanted to develop an evaluation plan for their Beat the Heat campaign. If you remember back in 1995, I want to say, with the Great Heat Wave in Chicago. Does anyone remember? Yeah? Am I wrong? 95, right? Okay, so what happened then? What happened in Chicago at that time? It was like record heat for days, really high temperatures, and a significant population was very negatively impacted by it. Who was that in the mean streets of Chicago?
The elderly, people lived alone.
Right. People who were alone and who were elderly and could not get out into these cooling centers or did not have anybody checking in on them, right? So they didn't have a whole lot of social capital or people or neighbors who knew whether or not they needed help. And they also lived in a lot of low income housing situations. So they actually didn't have cooling facilities. And in Chicago, why would you need air conditioning? Because it's Chicago. But more and more, what we're seeing is that these northern states are using their air conditioning much more, but their infrastructure was not primed already for that type of an event. So they wanted to, but in Florida, that's not necessarily an issue because it's hot all the time. But what we're seeing again is that there's an increase in sort of the duration and the intensity of the heat, but we still have a great group of very vulnerable populations. So they're trying to figure out how can we evaluate whether what we've already been doing that addresses the climate risk, not necessarily participating in this BRACE program, but what we're already doing is actually working. So we worked with them, awarded them a mini grant, came up with suggestions and recommendations on developing their evaluation plan through collaboration and technical support, and they've now finalized the evaluation plan and looking to implement it. So this is sort of one of the graphics from their Beat the Heat campaign, and it had a couple of components in the campaign where they would go around to lower income communities of color and provide communication materials on what to do in the event of an extreme heat event. They had a radio spot. They were thinking about, they also did presentations at organizations and community groups that would partner with them, and they were also wanted to do sort of a social media campaign. So they were trying to figure out how can we evaluate whether or not people are hearing what we're saying, whether they're taking the advice, whether it's changing behavior or increasing their knowledge and awareness. And that's what we wanted them to sort of go through. How do you create a plan that is strategically laid out to identify, well, these are the indicators and these are the metrics that will help us figure out whether or not it's succeeded or it hasn't succeeded. So now that they have that evaluation plan, through the support of their very, very nice interns, they're gonna go implement it in the next summer, and we're going to see whether or not what they've been doing has been working and if they have to make any types of changes in the future. And then the final project that we have going on is the Monroe post-Irma evaluation. Now that's still in its very nascent stages because Monroe County was so significantly impacted by Irma. They're just trying to figure out what happened, right? Particularly with the special needs shelter, just as Vasu was saying that when you have a concentration of certain groups in one place, the potential for casualty and impact on them increases as well. So their special needs shelter and getting to and evacuating out of the Keys to the Special Needs Center, which is in Miami, they're trying to figure out what fell apart because a lot of people were not able to make it to the Special Needs Shelter. A lot of the agencies who they typically partner with in the event of a significant event fell through because they were also paralyzed. They were also being impacted. The people who were actually providing assistance could not assist. So they wanted to understand, well, you know, what were the procedures and protocols? What fell through? What can we do better? How can we move forward? So that's what we're working with respect to Monroe. So I guess I'm going to close off in terms of ongoing research. We not only sort of support the implementation of projects, but we're also trying to figure out, well, what's going on in other parts of the US and what lessons and best practices can we get from that? So we look to the other side of the country in a place that we think is way more liberal and far more progressive, and they have all of the opportunity to do whatever it is they want and see whether or not the adaptations and the innovations and interventions can be transferred back to Florida, where we clearly work in a more politically constrained environment. So this is what this project is about, really to understand what county health public departments in California are doing to adapt and prepare for climate change, and how, how can we learn from, the pioneer in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation. So we're asking a couple of questions. What are we seeing in terms of the trends for adaptation, as well as the impacts that they're facing with respect to public health? What are their barriers to implementing these climate adaptation plans, and how have they overcome these barriers? And what do you think we're finding? Like first findings. I'm not going to drop the article yet, but what do you think are the first findings?
Similar procedure, maybe?
Similar in certain places. It depends. Just like in Florida, it depends on where you live. And when I thought our initial hypothesis was like the whole of California, especially on the coast, would be doing some type of adaptation work with respect to public health. And that's not the case, just as it is in Florida. In Southern California, which is more sort of blue and liberal, we're seeing more space, energy, resources, time, action in terms of developing adaptation interventions and public health. In the central part of Florida, that is not the case. It is very politically constrained, and public health staff and officials are trying to find ways to be very creative and incremental and slowly work through it, but not frame it in climate change terms. We're getting accustomed to sort of using these coded terms of we're looking at heat extremes, or we're looking at the hazard itself, or flooding, as opposed to adapting to climate change, because that will just throw the conversation off the table. And then in the north, like the San Francisco Bay Area, they're way ahead of everybody else because their hazard salience is so real. They're seeing the real-time impacts of things that aren't typically linked to public health, like sea level rise. So these county health departments are partnering with the planning departments, who are also developing their county adaptation plans to figure out ways to address and integrate all of these strategies, because a lot of times there is a lot of overlap in terms of what to do to respond to climate hazards. So that's the initial findings. We still have a lot of sort of interviews to do and document reviews, but it's really interesting because it's sort of the same thing that we're seeing here in Florida. Okay, so I'm going to close with that. I just want to sort of acknowledge my partners at the County Health Department, as well as, okay, Ava came out. Okay, so Dr. Wajo, Ava Holt, Tracy, the entire Florida-based team, we continue to work on this. We're in our third year of the cycle, and we really look forward to doing some really good work here in Florida. Thanks so much.
Okay, we have time for questions. So we're going to be switching mics. That way everyone on our live stream can hear the questions as well. So if you have a question, please just speak up, and it's for any of our presenters that just presented. Are there any questions? Yes.
Yeah, this is more climate related, but I guess in terms of communicating with the public on the impacts of climate change and the intensity of hurricanes and tornadoes, has there been any attempt to sort of correlate it with a particular increase in temperature over time, or is that just beyond what climate models would be able to consider?
Yeah, well, I think in the case of hurricanes, I think there's some research showing that we can expect about 8 meters per second per degree Celsius warming. There's quite a bit of uncertainty on that. If you want to ballpark it, it's about 8 meters per second. Yeah, it's about 16 miles per hour per degree Celsius. So in terms of tornadoes, the research isn't there yet. And as I tried to show, I don't think it's so much ocean temperature per se, but it's the relationship between ocean temperatures and intensity as modulated by shear. So still a lot of moving parts, but we're getting there.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
I have one more for Dr. Elsner. A recent study came out showing that geographic occurrence of tornadoes is changing in recent years. Is this study consistent with what you're finding? maybe any shared mechanisms?
Yeah, there's been a number of studies recently that have shown that the center of activity has shifted from the Great Plains to closer to the southeast. It's not clear why that shift is occurring. I do think there are similar mechanisms involved. But when I looked at the power of tornadoes, I had to control for that effect. So I put in a term that monitored the shift from west to east.
Do we have any other questions? Can we get another round of applause then for everyone?